Welcome to the Embrace Her Legacy podcast, the #1 personal development classroom for millennial women, hosted by Embrace Her Legacy founder and CEO, Maria I. Melendez. Ladies, get ready to evoke your feminine confidence and be inspired to master your relationship with yourself so you can fabulously live your legacy. If you enjoy this podcast, please make sure to subscribe. Don't forget to visit us at embraceherlegacy.com, where you can support our mission by making a donation of any amount or sign up to become part of our community of volunteers and supporters, the Embrace Her Legacy Collective. Our vision is for every woman and every girl to defeat her inner saboteur, master her relationship with self, and live out her legacy unapologetically. Enjoy the podcast.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the Embrace Her Legacy podcast, the #1 personal development classroom for millennial women of color. And today I am going to be talking with our phenomenal, this is your second time joining us, okay?
Yes, it is.
You are already family. You've already spoken to our gals in our program. So Akira is a licensed clinical social worker and therapist, Akira Peterkin, and we're going to be talking about benefits of therapy and just the rewards, right? We all talk about like healing and doing the work, but what does life look like after that? So the name of this episode is called Thank My Therapist. And I love to start with like an anecdote or to give people like why this episode. I remember over the summer, it was like there was a situation I was in and with someone, and it was 3 of us, and then the other person who was there, she was like, how can you do, like, she was just like, oh my God, Maria, you're amazing, because I wouldn't have responded the way you responded. And I was like, girl, thank my therapist. That's exactly what I said. And she was just like, girl, like, whew, like, that's amazing. So I just want to really focus on the benefits of therapy, what it looks like afterwards, after you've been in therapy. Me and my therapist, I've been seeing her for a year now. So I wanted to talk to you, Akira, and just talking about the benefits and rewards of therapy. But for those who don't know you, please introduce yourself, a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me back. It's great to always be with you, Maria, and to speak to your guests. So my name is Akira Peterkin. I am a licensed clinical social worker in the tri-state area, so New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. I own a private group practice that specializes in underrepresented populations. It's called Amani Nia Therapeutic Services. And I also am an assistant director at Purchase College, which is the SUNY school. And I'm in the counseling and behavioral health services. So I do therapy all day, every day. And I try to bring the word out to our people to just get them seeking, like you said, finding the benefits in therapy and finding the benefits in asking for help and finding their community.
Got it. Thank you so much, Akira. So you are a therapist, right? So you're on the other end. Have you gone to therapy yourself?
Girl, I've been to therapy. I am in therapy. I am big on you can't be a therapist unless you experience therapy and you keep going to therapy. So, I love therapy. I'm everything therapy.
Oh, I love that, because sometimes there can be this preconceived notion that because you're the therapist or because you're the leader, that there's taboo, like you're supposed to have it all together. Why are you seeking therapy? Why are you seeking, help or whatever? But even me, I say something, even the coach needs a coach. Like, so just because I am in this position of leadership and mentoring, coaching women and girls, doesn't mean I don't need someone to make sure I'm okay. So I love how we just starting that and making it seem like it's okay to have whatever it is that you need to make sure that you're showing up as your best self every day. So why why do you think it's important for you to seek therapy, to be in therapy, to continue therapy? What has encouraged your decision to do so?
Yeah, well, my journey to therapy started in college. And as I identify as Black for those who don't see me. But I am from the Caribbean, and we know that in Black households and Caribbean households, we don't talk. We keep our private business in the home. And as I was in high school and middle school, I was going through a lot of things, and I was holding everything back. And I never cried. Like I stuffed everything. And my best friend, who's Jamaican, also don't believe in therapy, was like, "Girl, how are you not crying every time you tell me these experiences you've been through?" And then I had a panic attack in college, and I was having panic attacks, did not know what it was. And then one day in class, I had a panic attack. Went to the nurse because I thought I was having an asthma attack because I have asthma. And they were like, "No, girl, you got to go to the therapy, go to the counseling center." And that's how I ended up in therapy. I ended up like feeling like I was dying from an asthma attack. And they were like, "No, this is anxiety." And I've been in therapy. I did therapy pretty much for the whole college career. And then I stopped doing therapy and went back when I was in grad school because, being a therapist, you're exposed to a lot of people's traumas, and it was triggering my own traumas. So I went back to therapy. Was not a fan of that therapist. And then I stopped. And then now I've been seeing my personal therapist now for 4 years. So I'm in therapy because we're exposed to so many things as a therapist, and also you're a human being. And so it's nice to just have my therapist on speed dial and be like, "Can you get me in like in this week or the next couple of weeks?" And so it's just nice for my self-care overall.
I love that. Akira, there was so many nuggets, and you said self-care, which I love that. It's like it's part of my self-care, which is what I believe in as well. But there were two things that stood out that you said. You said I started in high school and went through college, stopped, started again, stopped, and started again. So my question to you is, do you think there's a season for therapy type of thing, or is it okay to have like a lifelong, should therapy be a continuous lifelong thing, or should be a seasonal thing and there's appropriate time to stop it? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it depends on the person. I think a lot of people go in therapy for an immediate situation that they want to just work through, and then they feel better, and then they leave, and then they know they can come back to that particular therapist, or they can explore new options. And then there are some people who just need that like support as a routine. Some people go on a routine basis, and some people do like a check-in. Me personally, I see my therapist on a check-in basis. I don't necessarily see her on a weekly or monthly or anything like that basis. I personally also feel like as a therapist, I like to say, I am just preparing you to fly the nest, right? I don't necessarily want you staying in the nest forever. I'm giving you the tools and the support so you can see that you can live life without me. And some of my clients just refuse to leave, which is okay. But ideally, your therapist is preparing you to navigate the challenges in your life by yourself. So it's okay if you decide to stop because you're feeling pretty stable and ready to conquer life on your own.
That's really interesting, because you said as a therapist, and I love that we get both sides of the spectrum with you. We get the therapist side because Akira is definitely a therapist, and then we get the patient side of it, right? Yeah. But you said your goal as a therapist is so that your client to go fly out of the nest, right? Yeah. And then I also like how you said it's to each his own, right? So for me personally, like my therapist, 2020 was out here just triggering everything about life. So that's 2020 for me personally triggered a lot of childhood stuff. So that's why I decided to get into therapy. And then I noticed just kind of the benefits of having someone to just talk to, once, twice a month. And I was just like, okay, I like this. So for me, I am now committed to having my therapist as part of my overall self-care mental health action plan. So it's someone, she's there, right? So if there's ever an issue, I can talk to her. And the benefit for me has been just hearing someone else's perspective and then realizing that, I don't want to say that I'm tripping in my mind, but sometimes just listening to someone, you're like, well, I never thought about it like that. So I just encourage our listeners that it's to each his own. Of course, I'm sure, Akira, that there are situations where, people need, to see maybe a therapist daily, weekly, whatever. And then you grow from there. So speaking of that, what have been some of your greatest rewards from therapy?
Ooh, that's a good question. Well, what I would say is my early moments in therapy, I've been through a lot of trauma. I'm a survivor of so many, like, sexual abuse and domestic violence and things of that nature. So I feel like the first reward I gained from therapy was to be able to unpack some of those things, right? And like be able to like be honest with those experiences in a safe way. So those was my first rewards from seeking therapy. And then now that I'm kind of pretty much healed from the things I've been through and I'm openly talking about things and finding power in my trauma story, for me, my therapist the reward that I get from my therapist now is being able to just ask for help and really allowing myself to be more and more vulnerable as a human being and recognizing like I don't have to navigate life on my own, do everything by myself, because I know I'm capable. I know I'm strong and capable to do things, but I can also learn to ask for help. So, my work with my current therapist has been to like ask for help in my relationship, and also like keep using my voice to set boundaries with people. So I feel like I've gained a lot of nuggets in therapy, and it's definitely helped me grow and blossom as a human being, and also as a therapist too. Like it's helped me also, I practice what I preach. So like I gained some new skills to also bring into my room with my clients as well.
Wow, Akira, thank you so much for being so open and transparent about some of the challenges that you face. I'm sure there is someone listening who can definitely identify with that. And now she does want to embrace the healing process, right? What are some of the, I guess, how can someone look for a therapist? How does someone go say, all right, I want a therapist, what should be my first steps? Because that is a question that I get a lot from people. It's like, how did you find a therapist, and blah blah blah, and everyone's always asking. So how can someone find a therapist that's a good fit for them?
Well, there's a couple of like the internet is a great resource. So there are a couple of directories out there online. So there's Psychology Today, which is one of the most popular resources. Personally, I do not advertise in Psychology Today just because it's very centered towards like white people. There's a lot of people on Psychology Today, and I think is a great resource, but I prefer to advertise on like Inclusive Therapists, for example. It's a directory that's geared towards therapists who are inclusive for people in like marginalized populations, or just people who want to have a therapist that's inclusive. There's also Open Path Collective, which is, I know we've talked about this before, but that is for people who don't necessarily have insurance and can't afford the high fees of a therapist. And these therapists are dedicated to have an affordable sliding scale for clients. And then you also, it depends on the age or where a person's at in their life, because a lot of colleges have their own counseling centers that it's, as a student you can use as a resource, either to get resources in your community or to use the counseling center for your therapy. And usually they're free. So I usually always say to my students, like, this is the last time you're ever going to get a free therapist. You might as well use it to your benefit. And so you can use your school as a resource to help find people, or you can use the internet.
That's simple. School, internet, what works for whatever works for you. And I think that Open Path was amazing for me. For anyone listening, I also say word of mouth. Like my therapist came to me because someone else was raving about her therapist, and I was just like, girl, who's your therapist? And there were things that stood out. She said, Maria, I think you would like my therapist because she was a Black woman and we share the same faith as a Christian. So for me, it was important to have a Black woman, period. That was the non-negotiable. I said, I cannot talk to someone who doesn't understand what I go through on a day-to-day. And that was important for me. And also wanted someone who shared my same faith. And, a friend knew, and she was like, I think you would like my therapist. And she was right. She was amazing. So I also encourage word of mouth. But to that point about finding a therapist that shares your same experiences around identity, was that important to you? One, that's the first part of the question. And two, how can someone find a therapist who can relate to how they identify, whether it's race, gender oriented, sexual orientation, gender? Let's talk about that.
Yeah, let's talk about that. I mean, my first two therapists did not share my identities, which, when you're being introduced to therapy, you really don't know you have options, right? And my first therapist was amazing. My second therapist, I mentioned, I was not a huge fan. And I grew up in Long Island. I went to private schools, so like it's, I don't think they're used to like people who identify as myself being, a Black immigrant from all these different marginalized populations. So they didn't see my trauma. They try to diagnose me with bipolar disorder, to be honest. Okay. And I knew like I had so much trauma that was being manifested through these ways, which I actually don't have bipolar disorder, which is interesting, right? So for me, that's when I had the moment of like, this is not really working. I don't think this therapist really understands the complexities of being in my body as in the identities I hold, and B, the experiences I've had and its impact on me. So I made it a mission to find a therapist I can relate to. So my therapist now is a Black woman. And she has locks like my mom. And so like, I find her to be like a maternal figure for me. Unfortunately, being Black and being queer, sometimes you have to pick or choose what you get in a therapist. So my therapist I believe she has, she has identity with the Caribbean too, and she's Black identified. She has the locks. She has everything in the Blackness that I look for. She doesn't have the queerness, but she tries her best, right? And so, because a lot of my marginalized trauma that I experience is more like racial trauma, not necessarily trauma around my queerness. I find it important to work with her and not necessarily leave her for a queer identified therapist. But I feel like the more marginalized and more intersectional the identities someone has, the more difficult it is to find a therapist that identifies with you, which is actually why I made my private practice. And so I think for people, it is important to have a therapist that can identify and relate to them, right? Because there's only so much you can learn in textbooks. And like while schools are doing more and more better jobs at teaching about marginalized populations and how to work with, diverse populations, the lived experience is even more powerful, right? And so I think it's important to be able to talk to someone who can relate in some ways, as well as someone who can see you and validate you, and not necessarily question your experiences. And so I guess the ways you can find a therapist that, holds these different identities, there is therapyforblackgirls.com. It's a good directory. There's inclusive therapists, which I mentioned before. I think there's a couple of there's Latinx therapy, which is one. There's also there's an Asian identified one, and it's not coming to the top of my head, but there are definitely special directories made for different populations. There's Black, queer and trans therapists of color network, which also have therapists that you can find who are queer and also trans who identify as people of color as well. So that's also a good resource to check out.
Wow, Akira just gave us a whole list of resources. I hope you were paying attention with your pen and your paper or your note on your phone. And I like, Akira, how you identified which of the identities your trauma would be most, I guess, linked to. And you said, all right, it's more with race, it's more with cultural background, as opposed to your queerness, right? And that's important. So I think that with that, for the nugget that gives to me and to our listeners, is like, you identify which of your identities is most, linked to the challenges that you're having, whether it's your race, whether it's, sexual orientation, whether it's gender, whether it's cultural background, whatever. I think that's important. And like I said, for me, I was like, you said the lived experience is totally different. And speaking to my therapist as a Black woman, she gets it, right? She's like, I totally understand that. So you have to find out what's good for you. Now, I don't know if you've ever dealt with this in therapy, and it's something that I still deal with sometimes, and I know someone listening probably deal with. How can someone overcome feelings of shame and judging yourself when sharing thoughts and experiences with a therapist?
That's a really good question. Well, I think it's important to understand what shame is, right? Like, there's a difference between shame and guilt. Shame is something's wrong with us. It's who we are, whereas guilt is we did something wrong, right? And if we think about how shame is manifested, it is usually through silence, where we keep our stuff in because we're afraid of talking through it. It's usually from people judging us for our experiences as well. And so it's understandable why it will be difficult to open up to a therapist when we have learned to keep our experiences to ourselves as a way to protect ourselves, right? So I think the first thing is like navigate and trust with your therapist, and sometimes it's testing the waters too, right? And like starting with a small thing that's not so shameful and seeing how the therapist reacts, and then working your way up. I think it's also about you being in the driver's seat and finding a way that you feel comfortable sharing the experiences, and you celebrating the little steps that you take along the way. I think that's also essential. And finding a way that you feel most comfortable sharing it. So whether it's writing it in a letter that you bring to therapy, for example, and you say, like, I just want to read this. I have clients who bring their journals, like, I just need to unpack this. Or whether it's, sometimes I have clients shooting me a text and saying, because I don't want to forget and I don't want to avoid this topic, can we touch on this specific topic when I see you, right? Okay. And so the therapist can hold you accountable to really like motivate you to share whatever it is that you want to share. Sometimes bring a song in that you feel like you can relate to and saying like, this is some of the experiences I've had, and like, oh, this song speaks to me, and then having the therapist work through like, what about that song speaks to you. Sometimes it's really just finding the medium that helps us feel comfortable to start that initial conversation and then working your way through it. So I don't know if that's helpful, but shame is a process to unpack because it takes time to build shame. So it's going to take time to dismantle the shame too.
Oh, that's good. That's good. And I love how you hit it, that shame and guilt are two totally different things. And shame is this constant message that something's wrong with me. Yeah. And that is something that'll take time and effort to unpack as well. So as we're talking about, I guess, more the patient side of therapy and how can someone benefit the most, like, how does someone become a more effective patient of therapy? Like, what do they do the first time they come? Like, how do they prepare? How do they get to the point where they're flying out the next? Like, how does someone become a most effective patient of therapy?
Well, I think that's the important piece here. Like, your therapist is not supposed to do all the work. You are, right? Like, your therapist is supposed to be a guide. It's supposed to be a mentor. It's supposed to be a support. I like to say, I am the passenger seat holding the map of your options, and you're driving and navigating. You're telling me where to go, right? And so how do we get to the point where we're, being a really good patient? It's by doing the work outside of therapy, right? And so in the beginning of therapy, it depends on your therapist, but usually therapists start with like an intake process. They usually have you fill out some paperwork. They try to get a picture of like your story and the things you're trying to work on. And so a lot of times the therapists we're in the driver's seat because we're guiding and setting the platform. And then as you're progressing in therapy, you're building that rapport with your therapist. And honestly, research shows your rapport with your therapist is actually what does more of the work. It's not necessarily the interventions, it's that relationship with your therapist. And so what makes a really good therapist is when you start hearing your therapist in your head, right? And you're out and you living your life, and your therapist is popping in your head, and you're taking those skills you learn in therapy outside. And so it's really about applying the work outside of therapy. It's not just what you do in the room, and that takes time to build. And then, what I do with my clients is I'm like, you're doing pretty good. You want to try like jump into every other week or once a month, right? To try to wean them off of me, I like to say. And sometimes they need some encouragement. And I'm like, we can just try it out. If you don't like it, we can go back. Or if an emergency happens, you can always come in, right? And then they realize they can live without me. So then we don't really go back. And then eventually, hopefully, they get to the point where they feel comfortable leaving. But for the most part, they're weaning down to like a monthly to like a every other week situation, and not necessarily needing to come in because they're applying the tools outside of therapy, and they're also learning and growing themselves too. So whether it's listening to their own podcasts or reading books on their own, and really just applying that growth and that process over time by themselves too.
Okay. Now I have a question about the right timing for therapy.
Yeah.
I have been in situations with people, and I'm looking, I'm like, wow. And I'm not saying this I'm a judgmental superior. I just look at people and I'm like, wow, you could really benefit from doing some healing, right? And I also in that know when people are just not ready.
Yeah.
Right? Do you think there is an appropriate time to heal? Like, is it true that there are some people who are just not ready? And for someone who's around that person, how do you deal with that when you're getting the therapized and you realize that they could be therapized, but they're just not ready?
Yeah, well, change starts with acknowledging that we have something to change and work on, right? And so it is important that the person feel like they have something to work on, because the therapy is not going to work until they realize like they can do some healing, they can do some growing. I think it's sometimes talking about your own experiences in therapy can help the person start like putting their own ducks together and figuring out like, oh, if this is working for Maria, maybe I should try this out, right? And especially if there's more and more friends around them that are going to therapy and you're talking about, what you learned in therapy and how, how relatable your therapist is. I think that's also important because sometimes people picture like the shrink of like someone in like this really like non-relatable body, and there's an image to what a therapist is. I think when you normalize a therapist, it also feels like a more comfortable experience too. But I think honestly, it's you as a friend. It's about like having your boundaries. Like people need to come to their own realization, and there is a time where the work is better done when you're able to realize the things you need to work on, or at least you're open to it. In therapy, there's something called the stages of change, and there's pre-contemplative, which is, we're kind of thinking about it, but not really, right? But when we're in contemplative, we're really ready to start doing the work of like, we're thinking about the things we need to work on, and then we'll go into the action phase of the staging of change, and then there's a maintenance phase. So it doesn't really work if we're just sticking in pre-contemplative stage. Like we have to really start thinking about what we want to develop and heal from.
Ah, good. I love those 4 stages. I never knew that. That's good. That's good. Good. Thank you so much, Akira. So there were I pulled up some stats for the CDC that women are more likely than men to receive any mental health treatment. And the article said that nearly 1 in 4 women receive mental health treatment in the past 12 months compared to 13.4% of men. So it was 24% of women, 13% of men.
Okay.
Why? And you know what? I'm gonna go there.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to specifically speak to my brothers, to the Black community, right? How can we encourage the men in our lives to receive mental health treatment?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately there is such a stigma about therapy still to begin with. And then when you put gender in the mix about, how we perceive vulnerability, how do we perceive strength, it makes it more where men are resistant. I would definitely say though, Generation Z is doing it up, right? Like they are really normalizing. They're one of the most help-seeking generations out there, if not the most at this point. So I am noticing more and more men are coming in from that generation, and as well as the millennial generation. So there's some work being done. I think also men can start within their own group to start talking about normalizing asking for help, normalizing not being okay, right? Normalizing seeing your brother cry, and supporting that. I think it's your friends can really start doing that work to normalize it in the group. And then, if there is someone in the group that has been thinking about therapy, saying like, maybe we can go together. If you schedule the appointment, I'll schedule one too, right? Or, looking for a therapist together can be helpful. I think it's also would be super helpful if we have more Black brothers being a therapist too.
Yes.
There is actually a website I think called Therapy for Black Men, might be actually a thing. But I think if we had more Black brothers as a therapist, right, with that swag and everything, and just normalizing therapy, we might see more brothers coming in. I'm just thinking about my own brothers. So I am the only girl in my family. I got nephews, I got brothers. My two older brothers, one would definitely probably never think about therapy. The oldest one, I had a conversation with him a couple weeks ago, and I was like, "Listen, bro, I think you can benefit from some therapy." He's thinking about it. The
Good.
youngest one, yeah, the youngest one, he is such a vulnerable. He's a Gen Zer, so he's very vulnerable. He's therapizing his friends in the gym. Um, I don't know if he will go to therapy himself, but at least he normalizes it for his friends, right? And he's thinking about opening a business where he does exercise and also implement the mental health piece of it as well. So there's other ways you can introduce therapy to the men, like
Ooh.
kind of just speaking their language too.
Uh, Ooh, I love that idea with your little brother.
Yeah.
And I do agree that Gen Z, they're out here, they're definitely different. And I want to know, because most of our audience, I can have a 16-year-old hearing this, and I can have a 45-year-old woman hearing this. So it's like with so much, I would say myself in my engaging with men, more Black men are talking about therapy, which I am excited about. And one of the conversations that I'm having with Black men around therapy and vulnerability, and Akira, you hit it on the head, is like a lot of them feel more comfortable talking to other men than they do talking to their girlfriends, spouses, partners, fiancés. And one of the things I've heard is their apprehension to be vulnerable for two reasons. One, as a woman, in those sorry, my phone is ringing. I don't know. People don't understand when your phone is on D&D, like so anyway, like I said, so it's the apprehension because of being vulnerable and then being judged as a man, and then two, us not being safe spaces. Like, I don't know if you've done this before, Kira, but I have. You're a man and you tell me something, and the moment I am upset at you, I will bring that back and throw it in your face. I've admitted that before. I did the work. I am no longer that woman, but back when I was younger, oh my gosh, I was like that. So I say that to say, how can we as women, and I'm talking women who, whether you're dating a man, it's your brother, your little cousin, your nephew, your father, whomever, how can we now embrace being safer spaces for the men in our lives to feel comfortable and vulnerable in sharing some of their challenges around mental health?
Yeah, I think you kind of hit it on the head where you recognized your own role in, creating an unsafe situation for men, right? We have to acknowledge our own stuff, and do the work on ourselves before we can extend that space to somebody else, where we know like we're not really a safe space for them, right? So I think it starts with acknowledging, are you ready to see a grown Black man in their most vulnerable state and celebrate it and support it and validate it, right? Or do you have your own preconceived notions around what it means to be a man and around what it means to be, a husband or a strong brother or whatever it is, right? So I think it starts with us unpacking our biases and our own expectations around the men in our lives. I think it then starts with, just sometimes having those dinner conversations and just like, start having some more vulnerable questions at the table, right? Now there's those beautiful card games that people play where they can ask each other like some deep questions. And so making it into a game, for example, where you're normalizing those tough conversations, and you really building that trust, and you're showing through your actions that, while they're telling you this stuff, you're supporting them, you're validating them, you're celebrating their moments of them opening up to you, and you're also keeping it a secret, right? You're not necessarily going and spreading the news to your mama, to your aunties, to your friends, and that man will continue to talk to you, right? I see it with my oldest brother. He has talked to me about so many different things. And I see it in my community with the Black men in my life, and also my clients, right? Like when they find someone, a female person to open up to and feel supported and celebrated by, they will continue opening up to. To be honest, a lot of men see their female friends as a maternal figure. And when you think of, yeah, when you think of maternal figures, they're supposed to be a source of comfort, right? So men want to talk to the ladies in their lives. They're afraid of how it might be perceived. And so it's really how we respond to whatever they're sharing would be whether or not they'll continue talking to us.
Oh, how you respond to when they are sharing. Akira, girl, you didn't hit some nuggets, honey. Akira said how you respond to when you're sharing. And then you said something in regards to not spreading the business. Like, yes. I think that goes for whether it's a man, whomever is sharing with you. If someone is being vulnerable, protect their secrets. And I am being so conscious of that lately. Like if someone is telling me something, you don't have to go spread it to someone else. And I know, especially in dating, and I'm talking specifically in heterosexual relationships, ladies, if your man tells you something, don't go scream it to your homegirls. You understand? And this is, and I think that goes whether however you identify as, don't go telling people you wouldn't want someone to tell your business, then don't tell theirs. Like, be a safe space, be a psychologically safe space. And another thing, Akira, that I've learned through the school of the hard knocks, because I've learned the hard way, I've learned that you got to be patient with the men in your life. You have to exhibit, do not try to force vulnerability. Let it come naturally. Like, don't say, and I think as women, I don't know if you can relate, Akira, I'm like this. I'm like, oh, and let me tell you, I know, my goodness, and blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm okay with being vulnerable at certain things. I'm like, and this is how I feel, and let me tell you about my heart and what happened to me when I was 5, and not everyone may roll like that. Yeah. And I've learned that there's beauty in being patient with those, especially with the men in your life. And when they do say something and they are being vulnerable, like, just be a safe space. Don't judge. Don't be like, oh my God, I can't believe you did that. And support it, and just say, hey, I'm here. And sometimes it can just be, I know for me, one thing I've done, I'm like, well, how do you want me to support you here? Do you want me to give you advice? You just want me to listen to you? What does that look like? So it's really being intentional in those relationships. And you also said something about, and I hate that still to this day, like, gosh, therapy is seen as taboo in certain spaces. And I love how you talked about growing up in a certain Caribbean culture and all that. I come from a Afro-Latino culture, so this was, child, I didn't grow, nobody was talking about therapists. It's just seen as taboo in many families of color. How can someone, or what advice would you give to someone who is being frowned upon in their family for seeking help and getting therapy and having a therapist?
Yeah, those cultural beliefs are really deep. thankfully with time, things have been getting a lot better in our communities. Um, I would first, for the people who are in those cultural, expectations, I would first like normalize and say it's okay if you want to, find someone to talk to, right? Like we all deserve safe spaces to work through our things. We all deserve, someone in our corner to, support us through our challenges. And so I would start with that, saying it's okay if you want to seek help. The other thing I would think about is a lot of our culture or our family expectations or our family norms, it's things that were taught to us, but it's not always the quote unquote right thing, right? And so sometimes not sometimes, in our adulthood, we grow and we realize our parents don't always know it all, although they tell us they know it all, right? Our elders don't know it all. And so it's okay to give ourselves permission to go against the grain, and to try something new, to try to start developing your own norms and cultural norms in your family. You don't necessarily have to tell your family too, right? Like,
oh, that's good.
Right. That's the thing about therapy. It's confidential, right? Like no one has to know unless you're under the age of 18. I'm sorry, you have to tell your guardian or your parent. But for those who are adults, no one has to know, and you can just try it out on your own. And if you feel maybe comfortable with time sharing your experiences with others, that's your choice. But at the end of the day, the therapy is about you. It's not necessarily about everybody else and what they expect of you.
Oh, I like how you said they don't have to know. That's so good, Akira. That's so simple. Like it's just like your business is your business. So now, Akira, now that's nice and said and done, but we in the holidays, okay?
Yeah,
This is holiday season, all right. So it's nice to live your nice little happy world when you're not in the same house with with all the family issues. Now, because we're in dead smack in the holidays and people are going to be around those family members and we're going to go back into, I don't know, those, I guess, trauma-filled rooms, or those rooms where there's dysfunction and things are unhealthy.
Yeah.
How does someone who's being therapized, right? What advice do you give to someone now they have to re-engage or engage with family members, especially during the holidays? How can someone deal with that?
Oh, yeah, the holidays are the most triggering times for people. Boundaries. So if you're lucky to not live in the same households as the people who may trigger some of your stuff, it's also okay to set a time boundary regarding how long you're going to spend in the house, right? Giving yourself permission to only spend an hour or two and leave. It's also okay to set the boundary with them regarding like, I don't feel comfortable talking about this, or leave in a space, right? Like leave in the room when things are being discussed, when you don't feel comfortable with what they're discussing. Humor also works, right? Like a lot of times when you're therapized, you start seeing people, like really start seeing people, and you can laugh it off like, damn, like grandma can use some therapy, right? Like so sometimes humor can be helpful to navigate those like difficult situations too. Sometimes having an activity where like you don't really allow the freedom of things to just be sad and arguments to be broken out or whatever. There's a game that we're playing, for example, or there's a movie that we're going to watch, for example, like there's an activity that we're going to do, can help kind of reduce some of those times that things can be said and like, trigger somebody.
That's great. She said games, humor, leave the room. I love how you said put a time limit on it. Like, you know what, we gonna go to grandma's house for an hour and a half, and that's it. You know, Carrie, these are good. These are good nuggets. Another thing you said, and as we begin to wrap up, because I know some of our listeners may be under the age of 18, and you said that they have to get parental consent. What does someone do? And I've had students in our programs go through this. What do someone do when, if they're 16, they recognize there's a need, they want to go ahead to help, but the parents may, whether it's culturally, whatever, they're like, what do you need the help for? They're against it. What advice do you give to a young person who wants therapy, but their parents, for whatever reason, aren't acquiescing to them receiving that therapy?
Yeah, those are the most challenging. Sometimes I get emails from teenagers and kids all the time who are afraid to tell their parents. I usually suggest going to the school, right? And usually there's a guidance counselor, there's a school social worker, there's some kind of therapy group. You can usually do the school route and talk to the person at the school, just to have that support and that like mentor kind of figure where you can process things. You do have to be mindful because people are mandated reporters, that what you share with the school, they might have to report, and then eventually your parents and guardians can find out that you shared something, or that you have been seeing the school social worker. So you do have to be mindful and careful of that. But usually the school is a good resource to check out somebody, in the guidance department, or as a school social worker, to start that process of working through things.
Got it. Thank you so much, Akira. So my final question is, I guess, kind of to circle back what we discussed at the beginning of the benefits and the rewards with therapy. What's something that you've learned in therapy that you now are applying daily in your life, and you see, I guess, that tangible change in you, that it's something that you take, that you're carrying with you daily?
Yeah, well, I've unpacked a lot in therapy. Also, going to therapy school, well, as a social worker, you have half of your assignment is unpacking yourself. So I've been doing a lot of unpacking of myself. So in therapy, I think really just standing in my truth and being more and more comfortable with who I am in my full self has allowed me to be less defensive in relationships. Yeah, because I really know who I am, right? Like I know my ins, my outs, my ups, my downs, my flaws. And because of that, no one can tell me who I am, right? So if someone's coming to me to critique me, I already know. Like I already know it's something I've already grappled with. And so I'm able to, when I'm being confronted with criticism, I'm able to thank the person. I'm able to not be defensive with them, and I'm able to have a productive conversation of how we can work through this together. I apply it in my relationships. I apply it in my my relationship with my staff as a supervisor. I apply it with my boss, right? Like I'm fully aware of who I am. And so because of that, I have worked really hard at not being defensive when someone's bringing something about who I am. And then I could say, you know what, you're right. You're right. How do you have any suggestions of how we can make this a better experience for you? Or how, is there something in particular that you want me to work on? Because I've normalized being called out in therapy, and I've also normalized recognizing that I as an individual have a lot of growing to do.
Oh, that was good. And Karen, like, talk about a way to end the episode. She said, I know me. Okay, so I don't have to be defensive. That was really good. Thank you so much, Akira. I don't know where I would be today if it wasn't for my therapist a year ago. She really helped me identify some stinking thinking, as she called it. And I noticed how, if I didn't do that work, and if I didn't work with her, I wouldn't have some of the relationships and the blessings that I have today, because everything was preparing me for this, for, now, like you said, I can see, I'm like, oh, this is what she said, where I struggle with this area of, whatever. So it's made my relationships most fruitful. And I cannot identify those patterns and behavior and respond to it differently. So for me, I'm going to have a therapist on call for the rest of my living life. I don't know how to get it out. There's no way I am not going to live my life with, if it's a therapist, a life coach, someone to just be there, because mental health for me has now become my main, priority. It's up there and it's superseding anything else. And I love that us as a generation, millennials and Gen Z, that we are breaking those, stigmas and negative connotations around therapy, and we're being so open and honest and saying, like, girl, let me tell you what my therapist said. Do you know how many times I start a sentence with, girl, well, you know what my therapist said? And I wouldn't have been so open to do that 5, 10, 15 years ago, but now I'm like, according to my therapist. So I just encourage people that there is beauty in therapy, there's beauty in healing, there's beauty in surrendering to that healing process, because then you'll see the benefits and the rewards and the fruit later down the line. So Akira, I do want to give people an opportunity if they want. I know Akira be booked to the gods, honey, but if someone wants to get in contact with you and your services, how can they find you?
Yeah, they can just go on my website. It's amaninia.com. So AMAN as in Nancy, I N as in Nancy, IA. So amaninia.com. You can also find me on Inclusive Therapist. I'm one of the first people that apparently pops up. So you can find me there too. So, I am booked. I am busy. I haven't accepted, unfortunately, any clients in a long time, but I am working on adding 4 more therapists to my group. So hopefully by 2022, I'll be able to extend some more services. I have a man of color that I'm trying to bring on. I have a Latina. I have a Haitian American I'm trying to bring on. And someone from one of the countries in Africa that I'm trying to bring on. So I'm trying to extend the different languages options as well. So check me out in 2022. But in the meantime, I am pretty booked, unfortunately.
Girl, but 2022 is going to be amazing.
Yeah.
Akira, thank you so much. Yes, for being on the podcast, and yes, for being a supporter of Embrace Her Legacy, but for your work in your service to our community. We need more Akiras. We need more of you. We need more therapists who look like us. I love how you pointed out, gosh, if we had more Black men therapists, we need that. We need more Black women. We need more Latina women. We need people of color and people who identify queer, everything, so that we can heal. We can heal as a people, we need that. So I thank you so much for your service to us as a community. And to our listeners, I really hope that you took away something. Akira, I'm going to put the link to your website inside of the podcast. So, just look below and whether you're listening or watching on YouTube, you'll have the link so you can contact her. Thank you so much, Akira. I hope that someone listening took away something and you can share with a friend, subscribe. And until next time, always be a woman who embraces her legacy.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Embrace Her Legacy podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please make sure to subscribe and visit embraceherlegacy.com to make a donation or sign up to become a part of our community of volunteers and supporters. the Embrace Her Legacy Collective. Make sure you follow us at Embrace Her Legacy to get daily inspiration and join our movement. Thank you for listening, and remember, you're enough, you're worthy, and you're a phenomenal woman who embraces her legacy.